Hello! So I'm just going to try and explain the workflow as quickly as I can so you don't have to watch a whole bunch of different videos. But if you want to know how to take an idea and turn it into a low poly asset for a game, then you're in the right spot. Alright, so here I'm just plotting in a quick design. You don't have to worry about drawing too well. As you can see, I'm not the best drawer in the world, but I rely on 3D modeling to perfect my design usually. Okay, so now we can start creating the base mesh in Maya. So the goal here is to end up with the final low poly asset. You could essentially start doing this in ZBrush and then we can create the low poly asset later, but being this an inorganic, non-deformable object, it's just easier to do it in Maya. So in terms of modeling techniques, there's nothing fancy here, but some tools to note are the multi-cut, target weld, bridge, extrude, fill gap. But in a nutshell, I just basically add points and move them around until I'm happy with it. So whatever works for you. So here's the final low poly asset. As you can see, it only has detail where it needs it. I did try and keep things quads as much as I could, just to keep good edge flow so I could cut in detail easier. However, because this object is not going to be deforming, it's fine to use tries, so don't be scared to add them if you need to. Okay, so now we want to create the high poly version with the detail. However, if we were to bring this into ZBrush and subdivide it, as you can see here, once you smooth it, it's going to shrink in and it's going to lose all that form. And if we brought it into ZBrush and Dynameshed it to keep the form, it's going to have a faceted look and it's going to be really hard to smooth. So what we want to do is basically create a duplicate mesh and just call it smooth or something. And then on this mesh, just go through and add some supporting edge loops so that when you smooth it, it keeps that form where you need the form, but it smooths out all the other areas. So like on the axe, on the round part of the axe, for example, we don't want to add edge loops there because we want to keep that nice and smooth, but where the point of the axe is, we want to add some edge loops there to keep that nice and sharp. So as you can see here, once I press smooth, it looks nice and clean, but it keeps its form. So while I'm in this phase as well, I'm just going to take advantage of having this low poly form with some nice edge flows. So I know that on this blade, I want some sort of rim or an inset. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut that in now so that when we bring it to ZBrush, it just makes it a little bit easier to start detailing it. So once you're happy with how it looks smooth, at the moment we're just using a preview mode. So if you press 3 on the keyboard, it's going to show you what it looks like smoothed. If you press 1, it goes back to its original form. But we want to actually lock this smoothing into our mesh. So we'll go to the top menu and choose smooth and just add a few subdivisions. Alright, so we're almost ready to export. We just want to do a few things. So firstly, we want to adjust the scale of both these objects. So unhide the low poly so you can select both these versions. Then scale the object up and position it somewhere on the grid that you're happy with. Once you've done that, we want to set the pivot point. So hold down D, then X on the keyboard, and then you can drag the pivot point to the center of the grid. Once you've done that, you want to go up and delete history, and then you want to freeze transformations. So now you can select the smooth version and export that as an OBJ. Okay, so now we can import that into ZBrush, and we're just going to auto group everything and then split those groups into separate subtools. So now we can select, say, the axe head, for example, and then subdivide it a few times to make it smooth, then add quite a high resolution Dynamesh. Now to add the detail, I'm just going to use the mask brush. I'm going to set it to drag rect and import a custom little alpha. Then make sure you set the focal shift all the way down and just basically start, dragging out shapes until you're happy with the design. Alright, so once you're happy with the design, just invert the mask and then we're going to just nudge the inflate deformer a little bit so it pops it out. And then I'm going to mask just that area and give it a slight polish just to make it smoother. So to detail the tip of the axe, I'm just going to go back to the standard brush and choose drag rect. And I'm just going to choose an alpha that has slight bumps to it and just sort of indent that in a little bit. And then you can experiment with some different alphas just to make it a little bit more worn. And then I want to put a few chips. I want to put a few large chips in as well. So I'm going to go to the clip curve brush. And if you drag this out, if you double tap Alt, you can actually get a sharp edge. And then from here, I'm just going to use the damp standard brush just to carve in a few more scratches. And then I'm going to switch to the trim dynamic brush and just go across some of the hard edges just to make them just a little bit more worn. And for the bit of wood, I'm just going to use the damp standard brush just to basically chisel in some nice little stylized designs, and then just drag out some alphas to give it more of a woody look. I'm not going too detailed here because I want it to still be sort of stylized. And I'm using the alternate click to pull out on the damp standard. Here on the straps, it's basically the same technique. So you basically just want to put in the little folds where you think they would fold. And then once you sort of just go a little bit extreme at first, and then you can smooth that in to give it a better look. And then at the end, I'll just go over it with a more finer pass. So with the block, I'm just going over the edges with trim dynamic, and then I'll add a few little scratches and scrapes just with some alphas. And then I'm just going to use a little technique where you just draw in some rough designs with the masking tool. Then you can use the negative inflate deformer, and that'll actually push it in a little bit. Just gives it a nice little sort of worn look, just a little bit more unique. And here's where I realized I actually wanted to add a few more things. So I'm just going to add a few nail heads to this bit of steel at the top there. And I also want to add a few little gems around the handle of the axe. So to do that, I just basically made a spear, just trim dynamiced it in, and pretty simple really. Okay, so once you've finished sculpting all the details, we actually want to merge this down so it's one object. And then we want to remove all the poly groups, so just press Ctrl W. And now we want to make two different versions now. We want to make a lower poly version of this so we can use it in Maya, and we also want to make a high poly version that we can use to bake. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the Decimation master in ZBrush. So just open that up, and for the first version you want to choose something low, so around 100 to 250 polys, and then just decimate that and save it out as an axe decimated version. And you want to make a second version. You can get away with about 1,000,000 polys, I'd say, for this, and then just save that as axe high poly. So you can see here how the decimation works. So basically it keeps all the detail, it just reduces polygons where it doesn't need that detail. Alright, so now you just want to import the decimated version into Maya, and just go over and do a pass of your low poly, and just make sure all the points match as closely as you can to the decimated version. And I'm also going to go and cut in all these sections that I added in ZBrush. And also add any new bits to your low poly version that you need as well. Alright, so once the low poly is finished, I'm just going to do a quick export and then bring it into Substance Painter. Don't worry about the settings and all that for now, because we're just going to do it as a test. But we're just going to go up to the bake options and then import your high poly mesh, and then you'll be able to see the projection cage. So try and reduce the cage distance as much as you can with as less red areas as possible. And I can see here I've still got a few little areas that I can fix up. So I'll go back into Maya, and I'm just going to add a little bit more detail in these areas, and hopefully that will fix the projection cage for us. And just move parts around until it matches the high poly mesh a little bit better. So now when I bring it back into Substance Painter, I can get the cage a lot smaller, So now you can see the cage matches a lot better. Alright, so here's just a few little things to try and avoid when finishing off your low poly model as well. So it's just basically to try and keep it as clean and as neat as possible. So now we can start unwrapping the object. So I'm going to start with a basic plane and projection mode, and then I'm just going to scale that a little bit so the checker starts to look square. Then I can make an edge selection and cut a seam so I can move that cluster of polys, and then I can just flip the other side using the flip tool. So for the bit of wood, I'm just going to cut a seam the same way, and then I'm going to try and straighten it as much as I can, and then I'm going to use the straighten UV tool just to get it so that it's as straight as possible. And sometimes you might have a trouble area like this. I find that if you just nudge a vertex and then select that entire cluster and unfold it, it usually works. And here on the strap, I'm just going to try and choose some seams that are as less visible as possible. And now I'm going to try and get the clusters as straight as I can, and then use the straighten UV tool. And then we can just shift the vertices to fix up any areas that didn't straighten very well. So once your UVs are all packed and looking nice, just check it out in the 3D view and make sure your grid is all looking nice and not too warped. Alright, so now I've got some smoothing groups that are going to cause issues when we try and bake it. So we just want to remove those. So I'm just going to select all the edges and then hold shift and right click and go to soften edges. And now we can export this low poly version ready for baking. So open up Substance Painter and import your low poly mesh, then increase the resolution and make sure you don't have auto unwrap ticked. Then open the bake textures box and increase the resolution and load your high poly mesh as the projection. And we're just going to adjust the cage so it matches as close as we can with as less red as we can, and add some anti-aliasing. I also like to increase the secondary rays as much as I can. Then click bake and watch the magic. You can hold shift and right click and adjust the lighting just to check if there's any errors. So starting with the bit of wood, I'm going to add a fill layer. Then I'm going to adjust the color so you can see what's going on. Then I'm going to group that into a folder. Then I'm going to add a black mask. Then I'm going to use the polyfill mode to select a cluster of polygons that we can then use to mask just that area. So now anything we put in this folder will only show up in that area of the wood. So I want to work on the base color of our wood. So I'm going to add a generator, then a mask editor, and I'm going to make sure I only have the color channel enabled. So we want to use this shading here to tint our wood. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease curvature so that goes away. And then sometimes I find it easier to, if you just enable the base color channel, you can see what's happening without the lighting information. So now we've got that, we can increase the ambient occlusion all the way up. And I'm going to have to set it to normal mode so we can see it. And now we can just adjust some settings so we get a good shading from our ambient occlusion. So here I'm going to add a gradient filter. And I'm going to set it to 2 colors, and then I'm going to choose a base color for our wood and also a darker tint as well. Just to give it a more stylized look. And I'm just switching my lighting back on just to see what it looks like. Here I'm just adding a new fill layer, just to give it another texture, just so it looks a bit better. I'm going to make sure that's under the gradient so that it gets tinted the same way. So now I want to darken the cavities a little bit more. So I'm going to add a new fill layer. set it to color only and then completely black. I'm going to add a mask editor the same way we did before, but now I'm going to only use the curvature, but I'm going to set it to cavity mode. And now we can adjust some settings to really show those cavities. I'm also changing the mode to soft light just so it blends in a little bit more. But you can see when we enable the lighting, it's still shiny in those cavities. So if we just enable the roughness channel, we can increase that to 100% to remove any shininess. Nudge, nudge, nudge. So now I want to highlight the edges. So I'm going to add a new fill layer, color only, completely white. And I'm going to drag one of the smart masks onto our layer. And that's just going to highlight the edges for us. So now we can just adjust some settings until we're happy, and then set the blending mode to overlay. And now we can enable the roughness channel and fix that up. You can also set the viewing mode to roughness map only so you can see exactly what's happening behind the scenes. Okay, so we'll move on to the axe blade. So I'm going to do the same sort of setup we did for the wood. I'm just going to group a fill layer and then mask it using polyfill. For this one, I'm just going to use one of the preset materials, and I'm just going to tweak a few settings just to make it look a little bit more stylized. So here I'm duplicating that layer and giving it a different tint. Then I'm going to mask it using that smart mask and invert it so it looks the way I want, and just tweak a few values so it's nice and scratchy. So I actually want to add a bit of color variation to this layer. So I'm going to group this layer, and then I'm going to copy the mask information from that fill layer and paste it on the folder itself. Then I can delete the original mask, and then I can duplicate the fill layer under the folder and add a different color variation. So now I can mask that layer so I can select only the areas I want that color to show up. So I'm going to use the polyfill mode here just to give me a quick head start on the mask, but I'm going to make sure I enable symmetry mode just so everything I do here will show up on the other side. And here I've enabled just color mode so it makes it easy to paint. So I'm going to add a paint mod onto that mask as well. And then I can just choose a brush and set my brush color to black. And now I can just manually paint in the areas just to fine tune the area that I want that color to show through. I'm also going to paint these little squiggly designs as well, because it's cool. Once that's done, just remember to turn off symmetry again. So I want to add a little bit of color variation. So I'm just going to create a new fill layer with only color enabled. And I'm going to add a map to that, and then I'm going to use that gradient that we used before, and I'm just going to tint it a few different colors and then reduce the opacity so it looks nice and stylized. Now I want to add some scratches, so I'm just going to add a new fill layer with only the roughness channel enabled and set it to 100%. I'm also going to switch to my roughness viewport so I can see exactly what I'm doing. Then I'm going to add a black mask to that and add some sort of scratch map. Now I can blur it and then tweak the levels so that it looks exactly how I want. Now here I'm just fast forwarding through the other parts because they're basically done the same way. For the straps, I just use the default stylized leather material that comes with Substance because it works pretty well. I just tweak the color pretty much. Okay, so I want the gems to be emissive. So in order to do this, we actually have to enable the emissive channel. So I'm just going to add a fill layer for those, and then I'm going to go to texture settings and I'm going to click on this little plus symbol and then enable the emission slot. Now we can enable emission for that layer. But you might notice that other areas might go a bit weird. So you just have to find what has been enabled on there and just make sure you disable the emission on that channel. To actually see any emission, we have to enable post effects and then glare, and then we can adjust the intensity of our emission as well. And we can start adjusting some colors now to get a good effect. Alright, so finally I'm going to add one more layer on top, and this is going to act like a dirt layer, just to ground everything together basically. So once I've tweaked some settings, I'm just going to use one of the smart masks, and I'm going to use the dirt cavities mask and just tweak some settings so it's not too intense but it's also there. I just find it basically ties everything together just a little bit more, so that not everything's so damn clean. And once you've done that, and that's basically it for this axe. Not the best looking thing in the world, but it works fucking yeah! So now you can export the textures and use it in a game engine and slash things, I guess. Speaking of slashing,